So, this is a thing on a irrelevant website representing an irrelevant institution, the Smithsonian. I don't know if I've ever heard of it, but in this whole conversation, quote-unquote, on the Confederate monuments, quote-unquote, somebody decided to write this article called "We Legitimize the So-Called Confederacy with Our Vocabulary, and That's a Problem because of course it is," followed by the most repeated line, at least one of them, in this entire quote-unquote conversation. "Tearing down monuments is only the beginning to understanding the false narrative of Jim Crow." By Christopher Wilson. Right. As the debate escalates, hold on there, no debate. That's the thing that they keep trying to say, is that this is a debate. No. As it's been demonstrated over and over again, despite most of the polls, in fact actually every poll I've seen, even ones conducted in hyper-liberal New York City, show most people actually want these monuments to stay. And yet they still are coming down. This is more of a case of, it's not a debate, it's tear them down or we'll call you racists. Anyways, as it escalates over how we publicly remember the Civil War following the tragic events at Charlottesville, Virginia, interestingly enough, a few days ago, a man drove his truck accidentally into a larger truck that was carrying a crane headed towards Dallas to tear down the statue of Robert E. Lee there. He died. So, this is a twisted argument, and don't take anything I say seriously on this, but if we're going to use their logic that this stuff is killing people, well, now we're one for one, because if that crane had not been headed towards Dallas to destroy the monument, that guy would have not died. Anyways, the passionate and contentious disputes have centered on symbols like monuments, street names, and flags. According to a study by the NSDAP, at least 1,503 symbols to the Confederacy are displayed in public spaces, mostly in the South and border states, but even in decidedly Yankee locales like Massachusetts. Interestingly enough, that's actually true. I mean, I live in New York, upstate New York, which is fairly Yankee as well, but you drive around the southern tier, the border area with Pennsylvania, there's Confederate flags flying. It's funny. Most of these monuments sprang from the lost cause tradition that developed in the wake of the war during the establishment of white supremacist Jim Crow laws around 1900 and as a response to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Those artifacts are not the only way we legitimize and honor the deadly racist 19th century rebellion against the United States, the country you think is deadly and racist because of what we did to black people before the war and to the Native Americans. Much of the language used in reference to the Civil War is problematic. Glorifies the rebel cause. Now, this whole thing about how these monuments were put up to sort of glorify white supremacy and racism, there may be legitimacy to that. There probably is, in the sense that these were put up by people who probably did hold to these ideas. But the thing is, I'm a firm believer that the meanings people attach to symbols and monuments change over time, and a lot of the problems, or the quote-unquote problematic pasts or meanings to them, sort of change to sort of accommodate or gel into the zeitgeist. And what this all means is that for the vast majority of white Southerners, and even Southerners in general, the Confederate flag and these monuments do not mean upholding a white supremacist society. They represent to them their cultural heritage, their regional culture, and a sort of source of pride. Much in the same way that, up in the North we have plenty of monuments celebrating the Union soldiers who fought in the Civil War, and, the South definitely has a much stronger regional culture, but this is not something that people actively use to uphold white supremacy. The thing in Charlottesville, that was the dumbest thing the alt-right has done so far, it seems, and that did they really think they were going to accomplish anything useful by drawing attention to these monuments that were already trying to be taken down for the past 2 years? On we go. The language we turn to in describing the war, from speaking of compromise and plantations to characterizing the struggle as the North versus the South, or referring to Robert E. Lee as a general, because he was, can lend legitimacy to the violent and hateful and treasonous Southern rebellion that tore the nation apart. Hold on, aren't you the same people that want to impeach and overthrow the president because you think he's an evil Nazi? Can lend legitimacy to the blah 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 that tore the nation apart from 1861 to 1865, and from which we still have not recovered. Yes, we have. It's been 150 years. The South is firmly part of the United States. There may be some secessionist movements, but the interesting thing is that because we are not a completely wholly centralized government, the Southerners can wave the rebel flag and the American flag, which they usually do, because they have a sense of their regional pride and national pride. They don't really conflict for them. But far be it for this person to understand that. Why do we often describe the struggle as between two equal entities? What? It's pretty known by most historians that in terms of manpower and industry and capabilities on the battlefield, the North greatly overpowered the South, with the exception of perhaps, generalship, because you had exceptional figures like Robert E. Lee. But industrial production, railroads, manufacturing, and everything but cotton, the North drastically outnumbered and outgunned and out-equipped the South. Wars are very seldom between two equal powers. Why have we shown acceptance of the military rank given by an illegitimate rebellion and unrecognized political entity? In recent years, historians in academia and in the public sphere have been considering these issues. Well, the argument this guy seems to be saying is that a nation cannot be given any sort of legitimacy. You can't refer to any of them by official, military, or political terms unless they're a recognized country, which, wait, what other country wasn't recognized in the New World until a good number of years after it was fighting a war of its independence? Mexico! Now, on we go. Historian Michael Landis suggests professional scholars should seek to change the language we use in interpreting and teaching history. Wrong think. At least they're being honest. He agrees with people like legal scholar Paul Finkelman and historian Edward Baptist. I've never, ever seen a person with the last name Baptist. That's absurd. When they suggest the Compromise of 1850 be more accurately referred to as an appeasement. No, it was a compromise because that's what it was. An appeasement would mean you're just basically giving into their demands rather than negotiating somewhere in between your goals and theirs. The latter word precisely reflects the way that Southern slave owners held in the bargain. No. Landis goes on to suggest that we call plantations what they really were: slave labor camps. How does that help us? How does that fix anything in an era when there is a huge number of human trafficking victims, so actual slaves? You think the most productive usage of your time is to want us to redefine the language we use to describe slave plantations 150 years ago. Also, we should drop the term the Union, because that's productive. A common usage in the 19th century, to be sure, but now one we only use the Union in reference to the Civil War, and on the day of the State of the Union address. A better way to speak of the nation during the war, he argues, is to use its name, the United States. Oh, they weren't a United States at that point. That was the problem. The Union was referring to an idea of trying to restore the Union. In the same way, we could change the way we refer to the secession of states. I love the sort of hyper passive-aggressive just tone of, we need to change it. We just need to be aware of how we speak about this. Like, oh, I'm surprised a woman didn't write this. I don't want to be sexist, but I mean, this sounds like something, you know, a white woman that blogs at Jezebel or Salon would write. This guy is a cuck. When we talk of the Union versus the Confederacy, or especially when we present the strife as the North versus the South, we set up a parallel dichotomy in which the United States is cast equal to the Confederate States of America. How? But was the Confederacy really a nation, and should we refer to it as such? Why should we care? I mean, this is the idea of, imagine trying to apply this to all conflicts in history, that they weren't referred to as... I mean, this is the thing he's trying to argue for, that we're not referring to it accurately. We all know that's crap. He just wants us to refer to it, to change our language so we're distracted as they destroy all the monuments. Because if we were to actually do this accurately, then, well, when people talk about World War II, they often refer to Germany as Nazi Germany, as opposed to the state of the German Reich, or whatever official name Hitler and the Nazis gave it, or saying the Nazis invaded the USSR, when not all of the Germans in the Wehrmacht were actual Nazis. A good number of them were, but the official sort of political arm, of course the SS and Waffen-SS, were a separate branch from the General Army, the Wehrmacht, well, the Heer. But all this is to say, he is clearly trying to push an agenda with this, but let's go on because this is funny. When historian Stephen Hahn participated in the 2015 History Film Forum at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, he noted that using these customary terms to tell the story of the Civil War is convenient and traditional. Hahn suggests we use the War of the Rebellion as it lends legitimacy to the Confederacy. So it sounds more like Star Wars. Where are the rebel plans? There's a great documentary, well, actually I haven't seen most of it. It's great because James Earl Jones narrates it about, I can't remember exactly what Civil War battle, but it's hilarious hearing him talk about the rebel armies were marching through Virginia. Anyways, if you think about it, Hahn said, nobody in the world recognized the Confederacy because they were losing. For the first several years of the Revolutionary War, no one recognized the United States. Had the South won at Gettysburg, there's a good chance that either the French or the British would have recognized their independence. Just like after Saratoga, France recognized the United States' independence. The question is, can you be a state if no one says you are a state? Of course, international recognition and support for the rebellion was intensely important to secessionist leaders, not just because Jefferson Davis desired the military backing of Great Britain and other European nations, but because they sought the legitimacy that came with it. Yeah, that's the same thing, you just repeated yourself, you idiot. Hahn says that President Lincoln and his administration believed that its leaders didn't have the right to leave the United States or the authority to take their states with them. And that's the debatable thing. From my own point of view, I absolutely think that states have a right. When you're in a federal body that is made up of largely autonomous states, they should have the right to leave if they so choose, if the legitimate authorities within them decide to do so. Because without that, you have the fact that, well, let's say I live in Texas and I think the federal government has gotten way too authoritarian, as I probably think it is. I think it's perfectly reasonable, I think it's perfectly legitimate to allow for states, if they want to do so, to leave. But the Civil War essentially determined that that is no longer the case. Because one of the more important reasons as to why Lincoln decided to pursue war is he was not going to go down as the president who let the Union dissolve. He just wasn't. Lincoln didn't believe they had the right. Looking at leaders like Lincoln during the war and Frederick Douglass in its aftermath, it is apparent that the concept of being careful about the terms we use to describe the period is not a new challenge. In his writings, Lincoln referred to the group he was fighting as the so-called Confederacy, Jefferson Davis never as president, only as the insurgent leader. Yes. What did the British refer to the Americans during this period? During the war? And if the so-called Confederacy wasn't a country, but rather what political scientists would call a proto-state, just like pre-Revolutionary War America, or Revolutionary War America before the war ended, because not a single foreign government in the entire world recognized it as a nation-state. What does that matter? Why does any of this matter? What does this have to do with racism? Then, could Jefferson Davis be legitimately considered a president? Could Robert E. Lee be a general? The highest rank Lee achieved... Okay, they are addressing this at least. I thought this was going to be a gotcha moment where it's, well, he was a high-ranking officer before he joined the Confederacy. He was a colonel, so given his role as general in service to a failed revolution by a group of rebels, how now should we refer to him? How should we now refer to him? Robert E. Lee, General of the Army of Northern Virginia, because that's the most convenient and accurate way to describe him when we're looking at the history. It would be just as accurate to refer to Lee, who led an armed group against national sovereignty. No, they fought for what they thought was national sovereignty for the southern states, as an insurgent or a warlord, if not a terrorist, just like George Washington. Imagine how different it would be for a school-age child to learn about the War of the Rebellion if it altered the language we use. Yes, then it could appeal to our agenda. How useful! When news reports about the debate over monuments say, today the City Council met to consider whether to remove a statue commemorating Robert E. Lee, General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. What if they instead were written this way? Today the City Council debated removing a statue of slaveholder and former American Army Colonel Robert E. Lee, who took up arms in the rebellion against the United States by the so-called Confederacy. I wonder whose side of this debate that would help. See, the thing is, all these things are technically true. The thing is, we all know you leftists love to play with language. Yale historian David Blight, whose book Race and Reunion called for a re-examination of how we remembered the war, saying, our memories are racist. Memorializing language and ideology about the Confederacy became a potent revisionist force in how we understand our history. The lost cause tradition, which Blight said he calls always a set of beliefs in search of a history more than actually a history. What leftists do all the time revolves around an idea that there was one Confederacy and that there was this noble struggle to the end to defend their sovereignty and to defend their land, to defend their system until they could defend it no more. And that image has been reinforced over the intervening years in popular literature and films like Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, and many monuments, as well as the use of the Confederate flag. Frederick Douglass was, Blight says, acutely aware that the post-war era might ultimately be controlled by those who could best shape the interpretations of the war itself. Yes, people in power do determine a lot of what history is, and that's why a good historian, or someone who wants to be a honest historian, has to try and fight through these biases and interpretations to seek out the truth. At least when I took history, when I majored in history in college, they did not tell us, you need to look at history so it best suits a certain agenda. You best look at history to try and find the truth. Now, you can never find an objective truth because everyone has their own biases, but they never told me to be as blatant as this. Just a few years after the war, Douglas had already begun to see that the losers of the war were winning the peace because he felt that the American people were destitute of political memory. Douglas often referred to the war as a rebellion and was careful not to speak of the rebels in any honorific way, and pledged himself never to forgive the South, how Christian of him, and to never forget the meaning of the war. On Memorial Day 1871, the day Germany was born, the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery, Douglas' speech was resolute. We are sometimes asked in the name of patriotism to forget the merits of this fearful struggle, and to remember with equal admiration those who struck at the nation's life, and those who struck to save it. Those who fought the war for slavery, and those who fought for liberty and justice. I am no minister of malice, and I would not repel the repentant, but may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I forget the difference between the parties, that bloody conflict. I may say, if this war is to be forgotten, I ask in the name of all things sacred, what shall men remember? Okay. As Douglas was already concerned that the victors were losing the war of historical memory to the supposedly vanquished, I am not sure he would be surprised that not far from where he stood at the National Cemetery, often considered the nation's most hallowed ground, a Confederate memorial would be built in the early 20th century to the insurgents he felt struck at the nation's life. Douglas knew day by day after the shooting stopped, a history war was being played out. It is clearly not over yet. Words, though they do not stand as marble and bronze memorials in parks in front of buildings or fly on flagpoles, are perhaps even more powerful and pernicious. The monuments we built with the language may in fact be more difficult to tear down. Well, that's interesting. I think I've said most of what I want to say anyways, but I mean, does this guy even have any sense of intellectual honesty? Because, as I pointed out, as a historian, as somebody who tries to accurately study history, you don't artificially interpret language or change words to suit a certain agenda, which is what he's clearly doing, vaguely, very thinly veiled as a way to accurately describe history, saying that calling Robert E. Lee a terrorist warlord leader of the rebellion in the War of the Rebellion, that's somehow a more accurate depiction of the history, which it is from his point of view. Now, again, I am not an expert on American history. I do know a good amount. It's not the most interesting thing to me, more interested in Europe, but from what I know about the Civil War is that the problem is that I think a lot of people have is that you can't look at people, what we often do is look at them as either good or evil, black and white. That the fact is this, that we also like to judge them through the lens of our contemporary age, which I almost never think is fair. I think there are, of course, certain actions that people did that are always objectively immoral, like killing innocent people. And I think slavery is one of those objectively immoral things that was very heavily ingrained into the structure of the South. But anyways, the problem is that on top of the fact that you did have this objectively evil institution of slavery, the vast majority, a good number of slave owners would have probably been very good Christians, very nice people, and you would have had a lot of slaves who were assholes. And you would have had a lot of abolitionists who were assholes and great people as well. The point is to say that you have people that may have been doing bad things, but they could have also been capable of doing great things. Again, the best example of this is Robert E. Lee, who I don't remember if he owned slaves or not. I think he freed his slaves, and he was personally opposed to the institution of slavery. And you know, the other thing, when you listen to pro-Confederate, pro-Southern people that say this is our heritage, they don't really speak of the idea, generally speaking, of the South, that they were fighting for the nation of the Confederacy, because the nature of a confederacy, as opposed to a federation, a federal state like the Union was, is that in a confederacy, you have even greater decentralization of power and even greater autonomy and sovereignty of the states. So they would say it's not that we're fighting for the, Confederacy in the same way that I think, like, I would speak about my ancestors who fought for the Union as fighting for the United States or the Union, as they would say my ancestors fought for Texas or for Virginia or Mississippi. And again, the point is, how do people, and why any of this should be relevant now is beyond me, but the thing is, when we think about these statues and these monuments and the flag and all that, the point is, how do people remember it or mean these, what is the meaning people give to these symbols now? And I maintain that the vast majority of white Southerners don't think of these symbols as related in any way, any meaningful way now, to slavery, to Jim Crow, to racism. To them, they see these symbols as their, regional pride, state pride, as symbols they look up to as being, people like Robert E. Lee, as being good heroes in war who may have fought on the wrong side, yes, but they were still gallant war heroes, and I think there is honor in that. So I think I might have to make a more, traditional styled video on the Confederacy, because I haven't actually made one yet, which I think I should. But anyways, tell me what you think below, and have a good day. Diabana.